new insight. And certainly our friend Bal haTurim is very a means for new and unexpected insights, because as we've seen, he frequently derives his teachings based on gematria, Roshei Tevos, and that sort of thing, which doesn't jump off the page, because it doesn't it's not limited to the straightforward meaning of the text. So let's get to our subject. I'd like to start at the beginning of Parashas Chayei Sarah, which in the art scroll is found on page 106 in the stone Chumash, that is. Vayu Chayei Sarah mea shana v'esim shana v'sheva shanim shnei Chayei Sarah. Have something to say on that first pasuk, but let's go on to the next one. V'tamas Sarah b'kiyas arba hi chevron. And wait a minute, maybe perhaps I do have something to say on that one. I'm sorry, I do. Vayuchaye Sarah Mea Shana. So Bal haTurim says that Sarah Mea Shana is Roshei Tevos Shemesh. So we're looking here at the third, fourth, and fifth words in this opening pasuk. Vayuchaye Sarah Mea Shana. So the Roshei Tevos, the first letters, form an acronym for the word Shemesh. Of course, you know Shemesh means sun. So the Bal haTurim says that this is a remez to a very interesting and important medrash. The medrash is found here in Bereishis Rabbah. It's also found in Koheles, because it's based on a pasuk in Koheles, Ecclesiastes, written by the wisest of men, Shlomo HaMelech. The pasuk says, "V'zarach hashemesh uva hashemesh." The sun shines and the sun sets. And the Medrash says, don't we know that the sun rises and the sun sets? Besides which, usually if we are awake in the daytime, we say the sun sets and then the sun rises. Of course, it's an ongoing sequence since the beginning of Sheshis and Bereshis. But if we are, let's say, in a wakeful state in the daylight, we say the sun sets and the sun rises. But the pasuk is reversed. It says the sun rises and the sun sets. So the Medrash says that this is teaching us an important feature of the way God runs the world, and the basis of that observation is our pasuk, in which we read here about the death of Sarah, and in the previous verses, at the very end of last week's Sedra, the Torah mentions news that reached the ears of Abraham regarding his long-lost relatives, long lost in the sense he hadn't been in touch with them. He left Padan Aram so long before, and he hears that Besuel Yaladis Rivka, and his would have been a cousin or a nephew, Besuel, he fathered a girl called Rebecca. And the Medrash says that the reason that the Torah mentions the birth of Rivka, who initially we know nothing about, of course, her significance will become evident as our Sedra unfolds. But as of last week's Sedra, the last verses in last week's Parasha, we know nothing about her. We don't know any significance to be associated with her. And in fact, for that matter, there are a number of other names that are mentioned about which we don't know further information. But immediately in our parsha, we read about the death of Sarah. Says a Medrash that Hashem prepares the sun of one righteous person to rise before the sun of his or her predecessor has set. And the Medrash says this is the case of Moshe and Yoshua. Before the son of Moshe set, before his demise at the age of 120, the Torah has already prepared and already described and already designated Yehoshua to be his successor. And the Torah describes that in some detail. And Moshe ordained him, he placed his hands upon him, etc. But the Medrash derives from the case of Moshe and Yehoshua, and earlier in our Sedra, from the case of Rebecca, whose birth is described before the death of Sarah, this principle, that's V'zarach HaShemesh v'Hashemesh. The sun rises before it even sets. Before the sun sets on one glorious era, the sun has already been prepared and already rises for the next successor. Now, I say glorious era. We'll see another angle on that in a moment, because the Medrash goes on to say another example of that, and which possibly involves some poetic license. the Medrash says that on the day that Rabbi Akiva died, Rabbi Yehuda Hanasi was born. Now, Rabbi Akiva was possibly the greatest sage of his generation. At the time of his death, he was renowned, and I don't need to review his biography with you. And Rabbi Yehuda Hanasi would become the leader in the next generation. Now, obviously, he didn't take on the mantle of leadership. He did not succeed Rabbi Akiva as the leader of the generation on the day that he was born. But it symbolizes the fact that Hashem brought about the birth of a great leader who would possibly uh, like define or set the course of Jewish life in the generations ahead on the day of the death of Rabbi Akiva. And the Medrash therefore means to tell us that the word Shemesh, I mean, haTurim says the word Shemesh is hinted to here because the sun, the imagery of the sun from that pasuk at the beginning of Koheles, V'zarach HaShemesh Yivah HaShemesh, is the operative formula by which Hashem runs the world. Now, the Medrash doesn't go further than that with regard to, it mentions a few other personalities actually, in fact, but the Medrash is dealing with individuals. But I would like to share with you an observation which is of a special fascination to me because, as many of you know, I have an interest in Jewish history. This is a comment of Ramban. We will learn in Bereshis, in the book of Bereshis later on in the coming weeks, where Yaakov and Esav have a fateful reunion. And Yaakov is greatly fearful about the intentions of his brother Esav, again, with whom he has had no contact for a long time. The last he heard directly from Esav, he was contemplating, and he was not just contemplating, he was planning the opportunity to assassinate Yaakov. That's why Yaakov fled. Now it's many years later, and Yaakov doesn't know whether or not his brother has had a change of heart, or he's still awaiting and plotting the opportunity to knock him off. Anyway, this is very well known to us. And when Yaakov learns that Esav is approaching with 400 men, 400 thugs, he is very fearful. And he prays, and Rashi says that he resorts to three strategies. One is he prays to Hashem. The second is he undertakes a charm offensive. He sends tribute to his brother Esav. And the third is he prepares for war, military strategy. And there the Torah uses the expression vahaya, that if Esav comes and he strikes part of the camp, vahaya hamachaneh hanishar lifleta, says Yaakov, the other camp will survive. By dividing the camp, I'll make it more difficult for Esav to destroy my entourage entirely. And if one camp, which maybe I'm going to be in that camp, or maybe I won't be in that camp, but members of my family will divide themselves into different groups. And therefore, if Esav succeeds in striking one camp, says Ramban, this is a kind of rhythm that will repeat itself in Jewish history. That even though we have been persecuted and indeed come to terrible harm at the hands of various violent, bloodthirsty, and rapacious enemies, but somewhere else in the world, in another province or in another country, there's another empire, or there's another ruler who will take us in, who enables us to escape, maybe not entirely, perhaps lo aleinu will sustain losses, but the Jewish people will survive. But some of us, perhaps, Rahman al will suffer. Maybe there will be some fatalities, but elsewhere the Jewish people will survive. That even if it's bad for us in one place, there'll be another place where it's not as bad. Maybe it's even good, relatively speaking. I see my sister Shira. I'm holding a mug. Ruthie bought me this mug. It says Indiana on it. So Indiana is a place where we grew up in USA, which was quite a good place in terms of anti-Semitism, hostility, persecution. It had other problems, but as far as that goes, it was a very comfortable, safe, secure environment. Says Ramban, and he gives some examples of that. And although he did not live to witness it, because he died in 1270 in the land of Israel, but he describes a pattern in which the Jews are persecuted in one place and they can survive somewhere else. The same thing happened in Spain when the Jews were expelled from Spain in 1492, long after the era of Ramban. They were able to find refuge, some in Amsterdam, some in Italy, a large number in the Ottoman Empire. In fact, the Turkish Sultan said, Ferdinand and Isabella, I don't understand them. They say that they are wise, but I say that they are foolish because they impoverish their country and they enrich mine. The Jewish people who were driven from Iberia, from Spain, and from Portugal, many of them went to the Ottoman Empire, and they greatly enriched the Ottoman Empire as well. So this is an example, and of course, much later on we find that as well. I don't need to do all the Jewish history. We've said that for another lecture, but this is a pattern. So to go back to our pasuk, when it says, when Baal haTurim, who lived a generation after Ramban, when Baal haTurim says that we have a remez here, Sarah Mea Shana, to the word Shemesh, the sun. It says, it hints to the Medrash that the sun rises and the sun sets. And this principle that the birth of Rivka is described, is mentioned in the Torah precisely in order to illustrate this principle, or maybe it teaches us this principle, that Hashem prepares the rise of one tzaddik, or in this case a tzaddikes, before the death of her predecessor. And this is the pattern which has, as I said, echoed throughout Jewish history. I just wanted to mention one last example of this, which for me is very meaningful, because I heard this personal account from Rabbi Simcha Wasserman, and he related this story at the wedding reception. It wasn't on the same day of the wedding, it was a few weeks after, actually. Ruthie and I were married in Los Angeles, and we had my parents, Zichron Baruch, had a wedding reception for us in Yerushalayim for their many friends. They were there on sabbatical at that time, and Rabbi Wasserman was there, and I knew Rabbi Wasserman only at that point only tangentially, but Ruthie and her family knew the rabbi, the Rosh Yeshiva, very well, and he came to that simcha, and he spoke, and he recalled when he was a teenager learning in Tels, which is in Lithuania. It's quite far north. And he was learning in that yeshiva. And in the summertime, one Motzei Shabbos in the summer, he went for a walk outside the city. And because it was so northernly, and because it was summertime, the sun sets very late and it doesn't fully set altogether. And he said that he was able to look in the uh, uh, eastern horizon, and he saw the first rays of the sun that were going to the sun that was going to rise in maybe a couple of hours from then. He turned to the west and he could still see the last rays of the sun that had set a couple of hours before. He said this was a remarkable vision, to see the sun rising before the sun even set. And he said that he recalled this medrash, and he related that time how he wondered whether this experience of or this vision, this metaphor of the sun rising before the sun sets, would be something that he would experience in his own lifetime as well. And the skies darkened over Europe. This was, by the way, probably in the interbellum period between World War One and probably maybe just after World War One. And as we very well know, things got worse for the Jewish people, to the point that it all came crashing down. Rabbi Wasserman was involved with yeshiva before the war in Strasbourg. He was involved in rescue and rehabilitation during the war. He came to America in the 1950s, possibly late 40s even, and he became involved in trying to rebuild Torah in America. And he related how he saw that America spiritually was like a wasteland. The direction of travel was headlong towards assimilation. The Jews who had survived the Holocaust, who made their way to America, many of them were broken in body and in spirit. Many of them had lost their faith, and as a result, the possibility of the revival of Judaism in America was clearly a very difficult proposition. And he said that he remembered that image of the sun rising before it set. As the 1960s wore on, he said the elderly survivors were passing on to a better world. And he was wondering whether those brands that were plucked from the fire, whether they would still be able to ignite the next generation. And he said he began to see, as the survivors of the Holocaust years were aging and again passing on, before the generation had passed, the sprouts, the sparks, the arousal of spiritual awakening were apparent in the American younger generation. And Rabbi Wasserman related this at our reception for particular reasons, and it stayed with me always, and I feel it's a beautiful illustration in our own times, within our own lifetimes, of this phenomenon, V'zarach Hashemesh Uvashemish. So Baal HaTurim alludes to all of that, or at least some of it, in his observation of the word Shemesh in the Roshei Tevos. I want to continue now to the next posuk. I told you about sending this in the next posuk as well. V'tama Sarah b'Kiryas Arba hi Chevron. Sarah expired in Kiryat Arba, which is Chevron. They're right next to one another. The modern town of Kiryat Arba is right next to Chevron. I don't want to get political, but that's the geography. Be'eretz Canaan. Vayavo Avram lispod l'Sarah b'div kosa. Now, I'm sure you notice in your Chumash, no doubt you are very astute, that the word v'liv kosa contains a letter which is written in an unconventional way. I'm talking about the letter Chaf, which is small. So Rashi says, he doesn't comment on every large and every small letter that we find in the Torah, of which there are a certain number that are written in that way according to the Masorah, but he comments upon it here. Rashi says that Vayavo Avraham lispod l'Sarah b'div kosa nisbech hamisa sar la'akedas Yitzchak. Actually, perhaps Rashi doesn't say it, but the Medrash says that he came to eulogize her and to cry for her, but he didn't cry for her that much. The small letter Chaf, I'm sure it's in the Medrash as well. Maybe the article even mentions it, but I can see that it doesn't appear in Rashi. But the Medrash says that he did not cry for her excessively. He cried for her in a restrained way, in a limited way. And much has been said about that, trying to understand why. One possibility is because she was elderly. She lived a long life, a full life, a fulfilled life as well. So his grief on his wife's passing was restrained. I find that a bit unconvincing, because surely his beloved wife, her sudden passing, which according to, although it's not explicit, but according to the well-known rabbinic tradition, she died at the time of the Akedah, which means that he came back, Abraham came back with Yitzchak from the binding of Isaac, from this near sacrifice, and at that time he discovered that his wife had died. Surely it would have been a shock, and he would have grieved very acutely for his wife. I want to tell you what Baal HaTurim says, though. It's something with a sharp edge. He says that the reason he didn't cry for her that much, and maybe even the eulogy was a bit restrained as well, he says because she brought about her own early death. A very sharp comment. What did she do to bring about her own demise? For which reason he even says it. I mean, it's a slight exaggeration, maybe a great exaggeration. He says that someone who commits suicide, we don't eulogize that person. We don't cry for that person, because the person brought it upon himself, brought about his or her own death. How did Sarah, how can we accuse her or find her guilty of such such behavior? Says the Gemara, as Baal HaTurim quotes, that mipnei shemasra din, because she appealed to the heavenly court to punish someone else. She said, "Let Hashem judge between you and me." She was upset at the way that Hagar was reacting to her pregnancy. She was upset that Hagar gave birth to Yishmael, who then was menacing her son, Sarah's son Yitzchak. And she said, "I'll just read you the words of the Baal haTurim." Baal haTurim says, "Shahisat kemo goremes misasa." It's as if she brought about her own death. Shemasrat din, aval nen shahit chila. The idea of masrat din is that she invoked heavenly judgment against Abram when she said, "Yishpot Hashem beinu v'necha." Let God judge between me and you. Therefore, she was punished first. She sought to invoke divine judgment against someone else because she was so sure that she was in the right and he was in the wrong. And she almost appealed to God to judge and to punish her adversary. And the Gemara says that one who does that is punished first. So says Baal haTurim in his last words, "V'hama'abed atzmo ledas ein maspidinoso." And someone who brings about his own death, we don't eulogize him. So according to this, Baal haTurim says something very sharp, that Sarah, in a way, was responsible for foreshortening her own life. Abraham lived to the age of 175, and here Sarah died at the age of 127. So it's not my place to contemplate the wrongdoing of Sarah Imenu, but I would say that for us, there's an important lesson. We need to be very careful with judging others, and even careful with, so to speak, invoking divine judgment, because a person only does that if he's so convinced that he's right, and therefore he says, "I'm, so to speak, summoning Hashem to mete out punishment against the guilty party," which is obviously not me, it's you. Someone who has that approach, someone who has that impulse, is playing with fire. And according to Baal haTurim, this is why Avram didn't cry for her excessively, because she contributed to her own early demise. I say again, quite a sharp comment from Baal haTurim. In the minutes we have left, I hope to do two final comments of Baal haTurim. So, of course, the death of Sarah necessitates Abraham's acquiring a burial site for her, and it becomes a family burial site as well. And he has something in mind. That is to say, he has a particular location in mind, and he asks the town council, B'nai Chayei, to approach Ephron on his behalf. Ephron has been elevated to a position of prominence because the word got out that Avraham, who is so highly esteemed, seeks to buy some property from Ephron. So suddenly Ephron becomes a celebrity. Excuse me. And so Abraham approaches him, says the cave that he would like to buy. The negotiation is fascinating, but it's not for now. What I want to share with you is what Baal haTurim says about the last words in the exchange. So it's page 108 in the Stone Chumash. It's Pasuk Tes Zayin, verse 16. Vayishma Abraham el Ephron, vayishkol Abraham el Ephron es hakesef asher diber baznei b'nei Chayei. Abraham heard what Ephron said, because first the Ephron said, "Well, I esteem you so highly, whatever you would like, it's my privilege to give it to you. I wouldn't think of asking for money." Abram said, "No, I would like to pay." And in the end, he says, "Well, hand over 400 shekel kesef," which was a lot of money. But what's especially fascinating here is that the name Ephron appears repeatedly in this passage. And every time the name Ephron is spelled Ayin Fei Resh Vav Nun, Ephron, and that means to say it's spelled Male with a Vav. Every time it's Male. But the very last time when it says Vayishkol Avraham leEphron es hakesef asher diber ba'aznei b'nei Chayei, that Abraham weighed out to Ephron the money, the 400 shekel kesef over lasocher in hard currency. the name Ephron is spelled without the Vav. That's the one time in this passage where the name Ephron is spelled without the Vav. Says Bal HaTurim, the name Ephron without the Vav has a very interesting gematria. Ayin Pei Reish Nun is gematria 400. Ayin is 70, Pei is 80, 150. Reish is 200, that's 350. Nun is 50, it's exactly 400. And of course, not by coincidence, he demanded 400 shekel kesef, which Avraham paid to him. So that is one observation, that actually his name is equal to 400 when it's spelled without the Vav. Says the Bal HaTurim, and I saw this in Rabbi as well.
Yeah, that kid's white bag, please.
I've got them.
The gematria of Ephron of 400,
I know that keen.
gematria of Ra'ayin. Ra'ayin is someone who has an evil eye. It means someone who is greedy,
You've got to open one of these.
is envious, someone who has an eye desirous of what other people have. So Ephraim, although he spoke in a very magnanimous way, as if he's going to give it to Aram as a gift. And by the way, a cave by itself is probably not such valuable real estate, because you can't grow anything there. For them, land was mostly for agricultural purposes. You can't grow anything there. A cave is not really that valuable after all. So Abraham wanted it only as a burial site. And again, the value was probably fairly modest. And he said you can have it as a gratuity. But in the end, of course, he asked for 400 shekel kesef. So that is the ra'ayin. That's as far as Bal HaTurim goes. But Rabbeinu Bechaya extends that further. And he says that this is a remez to the 400 years in which the Jewish people were in exile. He says this is a remez also to the 400 men with which Esav came to confront Yaakov. When Yaakov heard that Esav was coming with 400 men, so for Yaakov, the number 400 symbolized someone who wants to destroy him entirely. Why? Because 400 is equal to the value of which letter in the Aleph base? Aleph base Gimel Dalet. Of course, it's equal to the letter Taf, the last letter in the Aleph base. In other words, it symbolized the number 400 in Jewish symbolism represents someone who wants it all, who wants to destroy it all, who wants to capture it all. That's why when he demanded 400 shekel kesef, which was a vast amount of money, Aryeh Kaplan has a calculation. I can't remember what it was. It was equal in today's terms to many, many millions of dollars or pounds, if you like. Again, probably an exorbitant price for an acquisition of quite limited utility. So 400 symbolizes that. And that's why he says that the exile, the exile of the descendants of Abram was foretold of 400 years, even though in the end, perhaps it was foreshortened, 109, 210 years, but maybe it's another way to calculate the 400, whatever it might be. But says Rabbeinu Bechaya, that symbolizes the destruction and the annihilation of the descendants of Abraham. Because if they're in exile for 400 years, that's the end. That 400 symbolizes the end of the line. The Jewish people would never be able to emerge from such a crucible, from such a place of physical as well as spiritual repression. That is why they were redeemed perhaps earlier than 400 years, but when they were finally redeemed, it happened in a heartbeat. It happened at the stroke of midnight. And if the Jewish people had stayed there any longer, perhaps they would have been beyond the point of no return. That is all symbolized in the 400 of the name Ephron, which is spelt in the last occasion when he demanded 400 shekel kesef, and Amram weighed it out and handed it over to him in the name Ephron without the Vav. Gematria 400. In the last minute or two we have left, I want to share with you a beautiful thought that he says at the end. Well, it's not the end of the parsha, but it's the end of our shir. It says in later on in Perek Chaf Daled, chapter 24, pasuk Lamed Gimel. So this is where the Eved Avraham has been welcomed into the household of Rivka. He thinks that Rivka is going to be the bride for Yitzchak, and of course, turns out to be the case. And the family gave him something to eat. So Pasuk Lamed Gimel, page 114, if you're with me in the Stone Chumash, it says, Vayusam lefanav le'echol. They placed food before him. Vayomer lo ochal ad asher dibarti dvaraya. I'm not going to eat until I speak. I got something to say first. Vayomer daber, and they say, okay, speak. Now, I said that word, the first word is vayusam. If you look in the margin in the art scroll, that's what it says, vayusam. However, in the text of the Chumash and in the text of the Torah, it's spelt with two yuds, vayisam. Says Bal haTurim, there's one other place in all of the Hebrew scriptures where the word vayisam appears. And it means, and he placed. Vayusam means, and it was placed in the passive. Vayisam means that he was placed. Where's one other place? He was placed. Yosef was placed in a coffin in Mitzrayim. Says Bal haTurim, the word vayisam, which is spelled, it's pronounced vayusam, but according to the Masoretic tradition, it's written vayisam, hints to the fact that this Eved Avraham, perhaps it was Eliezer, as Rashi says, this Eved Avraham was concerned that they wanted to poison him. And that's exactly what the Medrash says. They did want to poison him. That's why we don't hear from Betuel anymore. At first we hear from Betuel. He's the father of Rivka, but afterwards he's absent. So the Medrash says that they wanted to poison Eliezer, but a malach came and switched the food, and instead Betuel ate it. Says Bal haTurim, Eliezer was suspicious of that sort of thing. Vayisem reminded him, again in a sort of metaphorical way, of what it says later on, Vayisem ba'arom Mitzrayim. They want to knock him off and put him in a coffin, and therefore he had to think quickly. He said, I need to speak first. You know why? Because Eved Avraham Anochi. And in the household of Avraham, they don't just chow down. If they're going to eat, they've got to speak first. What do they speak about? Asher kidishanu b'mitzvosav v'tzivana al netilas yadayim. Hamotzi lechem min haaretz. We don't just eat, we speak first. We've got something to say. And he felt that the merit of the bracha would counteract the curse that they wanted to bring upon him. And it worked for him. She says, Etzleinu dibur kodim achila. Ba'unz, we have to speak before we eat. And as a result, the malach had, I don't know how long it takes a malach to do these things, but was able to switch the food. The idea which I would like to derive from this, of course, is to infuse spirituality and an awareness of the divine into the physical. The principle that eating, which we require for our survival, and sometimes it's even a mitzvah to eat, maybe on Shabbos, maybe on other occasions, Erev Yom Kippur, there are many occasions when it's a mitzvah to eat, and in principle it's a mitzvah to eat because we need to eat to live. But that act of eating must be ennobled, must be sanctified, and must be uplifted through a bracha. And that's why he said, they put the food before him, and he said right away, Lo ochal, I'm not going to eat ad im dibarti dvarai. And what he had to say was, Eved Avraham anochi. In the household of Abraham, we have something to say before we eat. Hamotzi lechem min haaretz. Borei pri ha'etz. I didn't make a bracha on my beverage because I had made a bracha before, but that's why I didn't hear my bracha. I said it before. In case anyone was wondering, I'm talking about brachas. You may have said, yeah, I didn't hear one earlier. Okay, that's Hilchas brachas. We'll learn a different time. But the principle, I think, is very important and inspiring lesson from Bal haTurim tonight. And thank you to everyone for listening. As I said, I once mentioned to a colleague, when we give a shir in the book of Bereshis, you're like a child in a candy shop. There's so much to choose from, so many inspiring and fascinating and really precious insights to share. We've got to live on ourselves to half an hour. Thank you very much, and Laila Tov, good Shabbos to one and all.